Hey all, welcome back. Here we are, post-midterm, and looking at the film Unforgiven. Okay, so our only a Western in the course, and we're going chronologically, post-Civil War, and one of the films in the course that's actually not based on actual historical events, but gives us a historical time and place, so we can definitely use it as text to look at the history of the Old West, right? Which also is a place where myth is more important than reality in many ways. So it's completely appropriate to be using a film that's not based on actual events because it's very hard to distinguish the two, to separate the two, true history from the myth of the American West. The myth is very important. Okay, so the idea of the American West is worth looking at. Absolutely, and ideas matter a ton, and that's one of the main points I'm trying to get across in this whole course is my predisposition for intellectual history. Ideas matter; they motivate people, right? If the American president believes the Old West was an extension of the OK Corral and that this is what it was like, that's his view of the world too, right? And so what we think of the past really matters. Okay, so Unforgiven. Amazing film, and I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe not. And if we were in class, first off, I'd ask you what you think is an Orthodox Western or revisionist Western. Revisionist Western. The answer is it's a revisionist with a standard old Western finish, right? And that's kind of out of sync with the rest of what Eastwood is giving us. Revisionist Westerns being like revisionist historiography, where they take those old myths and they reverse them. They say it wasn't like that, right? And 100%, we see that in many ways in the film that it's a revisionist Western in the way that that violence actually hurts, that courage and it is. It's not the simple case of the guys with the white hats and the black hats and the gunfighter being the epic, heroic, courageous figure. We see he's a very flawed figure, right? Our Clint Eastwood character, Bill Money, is a flawed individual with a lot of baggage behind him. Okay? So it looks at the effects of violence, and that's getting towards the central thesis of the film. Okay? The film, by the way, has garnered 4 Academy Awards, 2 for Clint Eastwood, Best Actor, Best Directing, and then Gene Hackman got one for Best Supporting Actor, and there was also one for Best Editing. It's filmed in Canada, by the way, in southern Alberta, which is standing in for Whiskey Gap, Wyoming, which is a very standard thing in American Western films. Okay, so the first thing we always do is we try and figure out what is the thesis of a given film, right? And I really do believe that this film, the main thesis, the main argument that Eastwood's trying to get across is that violence corrupts the soul, it affects people, and it doesn't solve a thing. Which is ultimately telling us something about the individual, right? That here in this time, in this place, the individual is not in control. And the individual here is Eastwood's, the main individual is Eastwood's Will Money. He can't go straight. He can't go straight. Old nature versus new nature. Violence. The old nature wins out. He tries not to let it, but he has to give in to it. So in this region, in this place, in this time, violence wins out. And what matters most here? What matters most here to everybody? What is their motivation? Okay? And we see that with the central conflict in Bill Money's life, where he's led back to his old life by the promise of easy money. Okay? So money is the sole reason all these desperate people are here, and it is also what is corrupting everything. And all of them, from the prostitutes to English Bob, to the Chinaman that he's here shooting. Okay, and we see that central theme, and maybe you caught it in the names. The simple device, William Money, is obviously his name is about money. Little Bill, right? Little Bill, and English Bob. All 3 of the central characters, their names are about money. So it couldn't be much more obvious than that. Okay, so this is the central theses, and then we want to get at whether the film works as history, and which is our entire task in this course. Okay, well, I'll say it's accurate on a few things. It's accurate on themes like race, gender, law and order, civility, gun control, which we'll look at in this lecture, and that central theme of violence, and that the individual is not in control in this time and place. The West is about money, and that's largely why it's a corrupt and violent place. Okay, so yes, it acknowledges the powerlessness of individuals to affect change, which is bang on accurate. But, and here's the big but, like many Westerns, it doesn't, it ramps up the body count on the side of the settlers, and it also doesn't really probe deeply into why this violence happens, that there might be a structural component to the violence in the American West in this time period, the Old West, and in fact there is. So that's where we're going in today's lecture, that this wider dysfunction has a structure to it, okay? So, and it's not random, okay? It's not random or episodic. Okay, so let's start there. But let's first look at what the American West was supposed to be. Okay, and we know this from where we got to in the course so far, the Jeffersonian vision, right? The big hope, the free soil West, and of which the Civil War was fought, right? Beginning in the 1830s, already the American West became more than a region, became this place of promise, this hope, and the Jeffersonian vision that it's the best insurance to secure democracy itself. This dispersal of land to the daily multiplying millions is what it would happen, right? To the yearly multiplying millions, and that's the whole promise of manifest destiny. Okay, and here we have John Gass, that great painting from American history, super important, of the goddess of destiny stringing the telegraph line to the west, and the forces of darkness fleeing from her as she brings the settlers, and stringing the telegraph wire. And this, Americans now, after the Civil War, there's no more impediment. Slavery has been solved, and the future is open, and it's freedom, it's free soil, right? We can finally have what had been expected all along, and we get in 1862, Lincoln actualizes that in the Homestead Act. And the centerpiece of all of this, the symbolic centerpiece of free soil, is what Lincoln does when he can. Now that the nation is at war and the South doesn't matter anymore, its opinions on what will happen in the Western states, which is what led to the Civil War, whether it be slave or free, he can pass the Homestead Act, which opens up all the Western territory to all Americans, any male over the age of 21. So any male of a certain age gets a free quarter section in the West, right? And this is, and then he also passes the Railroad Act, which will open up the entire Western country. Okay, so this is the myth, and for the most part, though, this is a complete fail. This is a complete fail, and that really, really matters, and that gets into the structure of violence in the West. And why it's a complete fail in the West is because the economy does not become an agricultural economy. Agriculture is seen as the highest use of the land, and that's really important, right? In the Jeffersonian vision and the vision of the 19th century, agriculture is the highest use of the land. The most thickly populated areas will be agricultural, and this is the vision. But this central national ethos, this ideological ethos, denies a very basic environmental fact, that most of the American West is a semi-arid desert, which is not suited to agriculture. So you've got this basic environmental fact that defies the ideology, and we have and the Americans are very, very slow, because it's such a powerful ideology, the Jeffersonian vision. Americans are very, very slow to compensate for that, or to change their view of how the West would develop. Okay, very, very late to accept the fact that the Homestead Act and the Homestead Vision will not work here, that the individual farmer will not have much of a chance. It took decades to realize this. Much heartbreak and tragedy played out over and over up to the Dust Bowl, when finally the vast areas are emptied out for the last time. We get these jackrabbit homesteads. There's 6,000 ghost towns in Kansas alone. And what this means is, at the end of the day, the homestead policy not only fails, but you have this paradox where the West remains to this day the most heavily subsidized and federally managed district of the country. Okay? The Western economy from the very beginning has been massively underwritten by the American taxpayer, which goes totally against what most people think of the West is a land of rugged individualism and independence. Okay, and that's because the Bureau of Land Management, their big mandate through the 19th and early 20th century, disposal of public lands to the public, didn't work. Okay, this Northern Republic vision has very limited success east of the 100th meridian, and that limited success is in the Midwest. Okay, but definitely not further west. So the Homestead Act fails in its vision of resettling the surplus population. Very, very few. About 32 million people come to America in those in the apex of the 20 to 30 years of the Homestead Act when after the Civil War from 1865 to the early 1890s. 32 million come to America. Only 2 million are settled on prairies, on farms out in the West. Okay, so 400,000 farms are taken up, 2 million people settle them. Only 1/3 manage to prove up their claim. Okay, prove up your claim means you get this piece of land, you have to put a claim check on it, and you have to still be there in 5 years. Those are the improvements you need to make, and it's simply because of that. The basic environmental fact of aridity. Okay, it's also other things. It's the fact that the railroads get massive land grants, and Congress basically unleashes these amazing corporate powers in the West by giving the railroads access to over 200 million acres of the American Western land. Eventually, almost 10% of the entire United States is given over to railroads in these massive land grants. There's also lands given to states for tax revenue, and then there's the fact that speculators buy up the best land under the Homestead Act and sell it to most of the homesteaders. But the basic fact you want to get is that there's less than 22 inches precipitation west of the 100th meridian, and this makes agriculture pretty much impossible there. And this is what dictates that all this land this land either does not get disposed of to Americans, to the settler, or it reverts back to the state. And we have this amazing ownership. You can see west of the 100th meridian how much the federal government owns, literally owns the land, right? The land and the subsoils, the minerals, as well as just that theme that the West is just one massive subsidy. Okay, so exact opposite of how most Americans think of the American West. Okay, and it has been from the very beginning. The fact the U.S. Army, which had to pacify, as the Americans saw it at the time, the Native American out west. We have the fort setters set up to protect the settlers going west. That's the beginning of this massive subsidy system. And then we have the Bureau of Land Management. We have the Bureau of Reclamation. We have the Bureau of well, we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Forest Service, the EPA, the MPS, U.S. Army, Bureau of Reclamation. We have the Grand Coulee, the Hoover Dam, the Colorado River Basin dams, the Central Arizona Project. All of this is billions and billions and billions of federal money that's meant to try initially to support this homestead vision, this individual vision to the West, that it would be a place of small-scale individual farmers on 160-acre plots. Okay, and as I said, a total fail in that regard. Pretty much a total fail. Okay, and so we have this paradox where the West remains to this day the most heavily subsidized and federally managed district of the country, as I said. Walter Prescott Webb said this. He said the primary unity of the West is a shortage of water, and the Spanish understood this. That's why they doled out land in massive holdings, right? Almost all of which are community land grants. Okay, but the Americans don't do that, and they don't learn from the Mormons either that the lesson there is that the best way to approach Western land is through communist efforts. That's what the Mormons were. They had communal labor, communal society, communal wives, big love, big water projects, and they developed water rights where the church itself own the water, and different bishops were allotted it in county councils, right? Americans wouldn't do this, right? They would fight the water wars in the West, and it's not till the 1930s that Congress finally recognizes, okay, this isn't working, and that's after revamping the Homestead Act from 120 acres to twice that, to 320. In 1909, and then eventually 640 acres, because it's realized that that's what it takes to try and make a convert this land to agriculture. And then there's all these other theories that rain follows the plow, right? And that gets this idea that if you break up the soil, the rains will come. We get the Timber Culture Act, where Congress gives out money, federal money is given out for people to plant sections of their land grants in order, because the theory is that with if you plant trees in the high plains, it will encourage the rains to come. These trees simply die, so that doesn't work at all. And rain does not follow the plow. Powell was right. In any case, what I'm trying to get at to you is that the individual homesteader doesn't have much of a chance. Rain doesn't follow the plow. To the extent that Westerns show this theme, which they sometimes do, they're getting at a dominant fact of the 19th century West, that the individual fails here, okay? And that's the biggest point I'm trying to make, is that Little Bill, failure at homesteading, his house ridiculous, right? Sits on the porch to watch the sunset. This is what he wants to do. Well, good luck, right? And Bill Money, failure at farming, right? Isolated, poor, not able to get this going, 100% accurate. Okay, Americans, after they settled the plains, as they settled the plains after the Civil War, don't compromise on this vision till the 1934 Taylor Grazing Act, which is 10-year permits to graze land and the right to fence public lands. And that's finally a very late recognition that comes after the Dust Bowl that this isn't working. And the point being, so much violence and so much unnecessary grief happens because of that failure to recognize that, because of that strong ideology, that Jeffersonian ideology that brushes up against simple environmental fact. So domesticity is hard here. Okay, but in this film, like all Westerns, that's just because it's the frontier, because pioneering is hard work. But in fact, it's impossible. Okay, in fact, it is impossible. Money is utterly alone, and he looks ridiculous on this little pig farm in the middle of nowhere. His pigs are dying, and he has no choice but to turn outlaw again, returns to his old ways, because it's the only way to support his children. Right, and the film makes it vividly clear. This is the antithesis of the American dream that he's living out here, right? The American dream dies in this environment, okay? The American dream dies in this environment. So the film nails that. The individual doesn't have a hope, at least not in homesteading and in fulfilling Jeffersonian ideal of the yeoman farmer. And that explains a lot, including the violence, okay? Enough said on that score. Okay, violence is definitely the richer theme in the film. In the film, many hints that it's worse in the cattle towns where Bill Money is from, but in any case, Little Bill, English Bob, and Bill Money, they're all professional gunfighters. So whether you're law or outlaw, that's what they are. And this is utterly consistent with the time period. And the simple point I want to make to you here is the context that the Civil War generation, very well acquainted with violence. Okay, so the Civil War, just as Congress unleashes enormous corporate forces with the railroad in the post-Civil War era, the Civil War also unleashes an enormous amount of violence. This generation has come through a crucible which we can't really comprehend. Here's a list of the war dead in the Civil War, and this is the standard figure for many, many generations. It's up until 2012 that more careful research was done, which suggests it's maybe as high as 750,000. In any case, it's just a brutal bloodbath that totals more than all the other wars in American history combined. And if you want to understand the brutality of the post-Civil War Indian wars in the far west, you only have to know that. Mostly these are veterans of the Civil War, right? These are damaged people. These are damaged people And there's all sorts of examples of that. Some of the most famous gunfighters in the post-Civil War era in the Old West are veterans of the Civil War, and often they're with militias that might not even be might not have been recognized, might not have worn a uniform, and those gangs that they were in during the Civil War perpetuate in the far West after the war, where we have this continuing tension between the Confederates and the Union forces, because your choices after that war are either to forgive and forget, which is very difficult to do, or carry those grudges with you forever. Either way, you're damaged goods. And a great example of that right there, Jesse James, who fought with Bloody Bill Anderson. Look up Centralia Massacre, where they capture and simply murder a couple dozen unarmed Union soldiers, and as well as kill a whole bunch of townsfolk, and that leads into a second battle, even worse, Centralia Massacre, where this group this Confederate militia goes out and kills 150 Union soldiers. So these aren't battles; these are massacres. And after that, what's even more shocking after that is then they behead, disembowel these soldiers, and scalp them. And they also tortured some of them to death. Okay, so ambushes, captures like that, and massacres like that are very common. It shows how the Civil War violence just bleeds into this post-war violence, this in the most brutal way you can imagine. So to say that this is a generation that is okay with killing is to simply state the obvious. And you have states like Missouri, divided border states, where it was the worst. 1,200 battles and skirmishes, 2 competing state governments. Union wins out by the end of 1861. But just and this is where Jesse James actually in the Centralia Massacre happens. But yeah, after the war, you have a choice. You either give in to your enemy, face possible execution, or you try and start over in the West. And many of those that do keep fighting for their freedom. Meantime, you're definitely damaged goods. Texas is very similar to that. Okay. Also, look up Quantrill's Raiders. Okay, if you want. Maybe don't. Maybe don't. But in any case, another massacre that Jesse James and his gang is involved in, which is his brothers and friends, which is the killing of about 200 men and boys in 1861 in Lawrence, Kansas. Okay. Texas, as I said, similar, contested between, and this is Texas in Little Bill's era of the 1870s is extremely violent. Read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian for a sense of that. Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian of the post-Civil War Texas, and that's because of their experience during the war. Okay? Texas was unique. They have this militia known as the Rangers. They're often anti-Hispanic. They have these brutal Indian wars in which the Comanche are pretty much exterminated from all of Texas. And then in the Civil War, they're divided between the Union and Confederacy. So Texas, along with California, is the most lawless area of the United States at this time period. And the point being, these regions produce many professional gunfighters. Okay, so these men that are scarred by what they've been through in the Civil War often become professional gunfighters afterwards. And Little Bill is just an awesome example of that. Gene Hackman does just such a great job in giving us a professional gunfighter who's, and again, who really represents that in this time period, the only difference between the law and the outlaw is a commission. He has a badge, but he's a sadistic bastard, okay? But he's commissioned, so he's the good guy, and he's shooting down the forces of disorder that threaten harmony, and this is bang on accurate for the time. Here's that line from the film: "Bill's come out of Kansas and Texas, boys. He's worked them tough towns. Afraid? He's not afraid." Right? And this is where he got his bona fides. This is where he got his creds, and that's 100% accurate. And the first place that these professional gunfighters are getting full-time employment after the Civil War is in those rowdy Kansas cattle towns of fame. that have been very, very carefully studied. So what are these Kansas cattle towns? What are they about? Well, after the Civil War, it's a fairly prosaic story. What you have, Texas is a place of anarchy. The cattle herds have been left to multiply, and they number about 5 million by the end of the war, and they're multiplying even faster than that. They're worth about $3 in Texas. They're worth $40 if you get them to Chicago, and $90 if they make it to New York. So there's a massive incentive to get these beef out to eastern cities, but also to these big ranches that are starting to populate the northern territories, like Wyoming, like Whiskey Gap, Wyoming. So what happens is we get these cattle towns at the railheads of these trails from Texas, okay, of these expanding rail networks. And what we get is the heyday of this is very short, 1864 to 1885, which is basically the era of the Old West. That's when we have an open range, and in essence, what we have is 35,000 cowboys working out west, many of them black and Hispanic, and they're driving. By the end, 10 million cattle north into ranch country or to these railheads. And with that, we get the Kansas cattle towns where the drovers and the buyers meet. The first of those is Abilene, Kansas, where a guy named Joseph McCoy is only 23. He buys up a whole bunch of acres and creates a compound and a place for drovers, for the cowboys to kick back and have fun. Getting their paying for the prostitutes and paying for their drink and hooting and hollering after 3 months in the saddle, and the buyers coming out. But of course, what they want is law and order. So this begins that real strong theme in the American West of hiring professional gunfighters to keep the peace in these towns, right? First one, as I said, is Abilene, and then that town moves 60 miles west, new town called Ellsworth, then Wichita, then Dodge City, then Ogallala, and as I said, by 1890, 10 million cattle have been moved in herds of 2,500 all over the west and back to the east. But yeah, what we don't want in these towns is violence, right? So we get these professional gunfighters that are hired to keep the peace, and that's where the Earp brothers get their start. Is doing exactly this, as does Wild Bill Hickok, who PowerPoint gives you suggestions of what to your subtitles. So I thought I'd go with that. Wild Bill Hickok, a person with a mustache and a hat, and he's a great example of that. Okay, Hickok is Wild Bill. He murders 3 unarmed men in 1860, but he gets away with it because he's a constable. To which position the good people of Kansas elected him at the age of 20, and they elect him because the better your reputation as a feared gunfighter, the more you'd be in demand. So you get these outlaws with badges, and again, the only difference between the law and the outlaw is the commission. He goes on to be Marshal of Abilene. He's paid $150 a month and a percentage of the fines he collects, 50-cent bonus for every stray dog he kills, not long before he kills 2 more innocent men. Only because one is a fellow officer, it costs him his job, right? And he'll go on to other towns, as will the Earp brothers, who most famously land in Tombstone, Arizona, where we get the most famous shootout in American history, the showdown at the OK Corral. But these are Republican gunfighters. These are mostly from the north. The law, the gunfighters on the side of the law, mostly Republican in bent, and again, their success is based on, or their ability to market themselves is based on their reputation as a feared gunfighter. That's how they get jobs in law enforcement and can get paid well that way. And then on the side, also running these faro taverns that make a whole lot of money, these poker houses, these taverns, and having a big name gets a lot of customers that way. But yeah, Little Bill Daggett, the first character we meet, sheriff, former gunfighter, trying really hard to create law and order, wants Whiskey Gap to be violence-free, not happy with the prostitutes wanting more blood, not happy with Skinny's news of the bounty, right? Presumes a swarm of vicious men will be coming for the whore's gold, wants to plant roots, sit on the porch with his pipe and coffee. And meanwhile, his MO is the same as all these hired guns, which is gun control. Okay, and that is another big theme in the film that is really well done. Gun control. Okay. And that line comes up in the film. Little Bill believes in gun control. If there's a gun, he wants to control it. If there's a gun, he wants to control it. And this is accurate to the time and place. Okay? Gun control was a fact in the American West. And this is why the Kansas cattle towns actually had a pretty low body count. Okay, they're very famous as being these rowdy places with these professional gunfighters and the big names, but in terms of body count, the ratio is actually pretty low, and there's been a lot that's been studied on that, namely by one of the big names there is Ken Dykstra, who uh, who's done a deep dive into this to show that these old Kansas cattle towns of fame were actually far less violent than American cities today. Okay, and it's partly with the FBI methodology that is used to get homicide rations that they don't work so well in small towns. So in any case, enough said on that, but I'll give you a quote from Richard White. Those towns, such as the cattle towns that disarmed young men, lowered the rates of personal violence considerably. Those towns, such as Bodie and Aurora, that did not disarm young men, tended to bury significantly more of them. But society as a whole was able to control personal violence when the community desired to do so. So the point is that the most famous gunslinger towns were pretty much anything but. Okay. 1870s, Wyatt Earp was called into Wichita because that rowdy cattle town was experiencing about one homicide a year, which the residents thought was intolerable, and Earp made sure that guns were checked at toll stations on the outskirts of town or confiscated. Okay? Gary Wills, Newsweek guy, he elaborates on this. I'll give you another quote. The cattle town experience showed that gun control at many levels was a fact of Western life. We're often told that gun control laws will not work, but they seem to have worked in the West. Okay, so gun control, 100%. Whiskey Gap, it's important, and it's how Little Bill stays in control. And this is true. This is true of the Old West and those cattle and mining towns where violence would otherwise be endemic. Gun control is a fact. Okay? NRA has had a slogan for a while. The West wasn't won with a registered gun. Well, just as the West wasn't won by the individual, it also was actually won with a registered gun. So completely wrong that way. Gun control worked well when and where it was implemented. Now, partly because most Westerns don't question the myth of the individual winning the West. In fact, that's the normal narrative. They also get the violence wrong. I said that earlier. One is they exaggerated among the settlers, and secondly, they miss the underlying structure or the cause of much of this, and the fact that there's a structure which is individuals trying to make it against a system stacked against them. And this is what Richard Maxwell Brown, famous American historian, famously called the Civil War of Incorporation, which is incorporating gunfighters versus resistors in the era known as the era of the territorial rings. This is a pre-state era where you have Colorado Territory, Montana Territory, Wyoming Territory, New Mexico Territory, and these corrupt territorial rings where what happens is the wider context is post-Civil War. The North is going into the Gilded Age of hyper-industrialization, and the South is very much left behind and becomes kind of a colony of northern industrial might, actually. And a symbol of that is John Weyerhaeuser taking over the very forests of the South, and industry there becoming very much controlled by northern industrialists who have the money. In the South, as I said before, has been bankrupted, right? So once the Emancipation Proclamation happened, it wiped out all the liquidity in the southern states, and it took decades for that to come back. So what we have is a very uneven economic picture where northern industrialists are gaining control of the West before the individual can get out there to stake his claim. So it's very much a done deal. The West is really won before the individual gets out there, and it's won by northern industrial money of the winning side of the Civil War. Okay, and it's regardless of what industry, whether it's mining or whether it's cattle. ranching. But I'll give you an example of that because we're looking at Wyoming. Whiskey Gap, Wyoming is the setting for the film, and the violence there is very, very structural. In fact, one of the most famous, what you might call a class war in the history of the American West is the Johnson County War that takes place there, which I'll explain. But first, just let me explain the methodology of these ranching interests. What they would do, because it's the arid West, and this is how the aridity and the environment begets the violence, is these cattle barons. And by the way, the cattle industry is massively lucrative because it's a very simple industry. You let your cattle go in the fall to forage, and then you round them up in the spring along with their calves, right? And so you can have an 80% profit in 1 year, and that's what the returns were in the early years on these. And I've already explained to you the immense profits you can get on cattle by bringing them to railheads to go to eastern cities. But a pretty simple economic setup. So you've got a lot of investors that want to get in on it, mostly in northeastern cities, New York, Chicago, whatever, but also as far away as the UK. And what they have is they have their own henchmen out in the territories that are controlling their interests, and what they're doing is they're operating illegally. They will get their employees to file homestead claims on the one watering hole for the surrounding landscape, right? So they will have their own employee get that one critical homestead claim where there is water that the cattle for the cattle that they're bringing out here, that they require, obviously, and then they are fencing the public domain illegally with this new invention called barbed wire, and completely against the law, because the public domain is open for anyone to free graze. Anyone who goes out west and has a homestead claim can free graze their cattle on the public land surrounding it. Okay, so by fencing them in, and this is what leads to the fence cutting wars, where you have those fence cutting wars in Texas, you have them in New Mexico, you have them everywhere, and they can get pretty brutal. And it is these free grazers, these individuals, going up against the big cattle barons in these fence cutting wars invariably. And there's some films kind of get that right, but they're not always the best films. There's that one with Kevin Costner called Open Range, which is exactly about that concept, but unfortunately not a super great film. But I'll give you an example here of how that can work if it's done well. John Iliff, the Iliff Ranch, Colorado Territory, 120 homestead claims, just over 120 homestead claims he files through his employees on these watering holes, and he fences the public domain, manages to control 6,000 square miles that way. Okay? In terms of the Johnson County War, Wyoming Territory, this is the domain of the Western Stock Growers Association. Okay? And in fact, the head of the WSGA is more powerful than the legislature, and the cattle kings run it. So the Thomas Sturgis, who is the head of the WSGA, is more powerful than the governor. He's the most powerful person in Wyoming in the 1880s. This is the man who knows everyone's business. He can make or break you because he's got ties with the only bank in Wyoming, which is the Stock Growers Bank in Cheyenne, and more importantly, he has ties with the cattle barons for whom he works. Who also have ties all the way to the White House. Okay, so and same deal where I talked about, where small homesteaders come to Wyoming and they try and make a go of it, and they get labeled rustlers. Now, what the WSGA does here is, and this is a great picture, great painting by Frederick Remington, the famous Western artist, What an Unbranded Cow Has Cost. What they do is they pass a law that every maverick, which are the unbranded calves born in the spring, that always cause problems because it's unclear where they come from. Any maverick in the spring, unbranded calf is WSGA property. So they're simply declaring prima facie that all the mavericks are theirs. Now this leads to problems, and in one of these rare incidents where you have the free grazers, the individual settlers fighting back, and that's the residents of Johnson County. But the bigger point is that all of this is completely illegal. Now things boil over, and when the Johnson County free grazers set up their own vigilante committee. They call themselves the regulators, and to defend themselves against what the cattle barons do, which is they hire 90 Texas gunfighters, professional gunfighters, to come up to Wyoming, and they give them a hit list of 70 names on it, and so they tell this posse, this is 1892, to head out and lynch them all. Before that, they've already lynched, the WSGA has already lynched Cattle Kate Watson and her partner for alleged cattle wrestling. Okay? And so in any case, the long and short of it, between these two vigilante groups, the regulators and these Texas, the invaders, the Texas gunfighters, we get the regulators actually ambush our Texans, and in one of these rare cases, the little guys are winning, and what we get is a 3-day shootout from that. The WSGA sends message all the way back to the White House that they need a rescue here, and the cavalry is sent in to rescue the Texans. So, but that's not the end of the story. Actually, not the end, because then the WSGA hires Tom Horn, who is a classic Civil War veteran who had been an Army Scout in the Civil War, then became a Pinkerton Guard afterward, and he becomes a hired assassin. And the WSGA hires him. They give him a list of about 90 names, and he goes off killing them one at a time. Gets quite a ways through his list until he kills a 14-year-old boy, and that's it for him. That scene is going above and beyond, and he pays for that. Any case, and this is the kind of thing that perpetuates itself all over the place. Montana Territory, we get the same thing. Stuart Stranglers, The War on the Rustlers, 1884. Lincoln County, New Mexico, we get the House versus the competition, and the House is connected to the Santa Fe ring. That's a territorial ring there, and these are politicians and speculators who run New Mexico. And they're getting all those land grants away from the natives and the Hispanics on the old Spanish grants. This Lincoln County War, one of the more famous, because this is where Billy the Kid and about 20 other professional gunfighters learn their craft in what becomes a 6 months range war after the street battle in downtown, if you can call it that, Lincoln. Of Lincoln County. Okay? The movie Young Guns is based on that one. Okay? So, and this is a classic story of resistor gunfighters coming up against the incorporators, who in this case in Lincoln County is not free range. The economy there is not is both sheep and cattle, but also mining. Okay, so this kind of thing happens in mining towns, and it happens in cattle towns. This is class violence between the incorporating side and the resistance side, and the resistors generally being Confederates from the South who are become impoverished by the Civil War, and they move west trying to make a claim for themselves, trying to make a stake for themselves. The incorporating forces tend to be Republicans from the North who are defending investors from back east. Okay, and that's the Civil War of incorporation. And one thing you might want to check out, this is kind of interesting, is the white hats, Agora Blancas, because there's also an ethnic component to what's happening here in this Civil War, and that's with these Hispanics that I talked about being defrauded out of what was supposed to be their by treaty their land rights when America defeats Mexico in war and annexes those massive territories, what today is Arizona, New Mexico, California. The deal was under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that the Spanish would be guaranteed their land rights. But as with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, this isn't always the case. In fact, what happens in New Mexico is quite the opposite. So where the Anglos and some, it has to be said, rich Spaniards, Hispanics are defrauding the poorer Hispanics out of their land. And we get the white hats going up against the Santa Fe ring as well, which is another fence cutting war in the Old West. A great example of that too is Tombstone, Arizona. Here's where probably the most famous example is exactly what I'm talking about, where the Earp brothers are Republicans. They're from the North, and they come to Tombstone having served in various capacities of the law, especially Wyatt Earp, in other towns, and now they've landed in the new big silver strike out west, which is in Tombstone, Arizona, not far from the Mexican border. And here's where they get very invested in the local mine, as well as in local real estate. It's one of these boom towns, and it's the bonanza economy, which again goes against the expectation. And this is one of the points too, is that this bonanza economy is not what was hoped for at all, right? It was supposed to be an agricultural economy, but this is what it looks like. And so invest in real estate, but also get commissions, beginning with Wyatt and then his brothers. And become tavern owners, which also means that they're effectively pimps, because taverns have that. And with the big name that they have as gunfighters by this point, they do very, very well. Now, of course, then they have to have their enemies, which are, in this case, the cowboys, which are the Clantons and McClorys, who ride into town and create havoc. And the last thing you want when you have, and this is the key point, when you have a mining town like this, the last thing you want is disorder, because you want the big investors to come and invest, but you also want them to stay. And it's easy enough often in these towns to get the first diggings are easy in gold and silver, the placer mining. After that, you've got to go into the deep shafts, which are very, very expensive investments. So what you want is the deep pockets from back east, and increasingly also from San Francisco, to come and invest in your town. And they're not going to be investing if they feel their money is unsafe, because it's a town of anarchy and lawlessness. So hence, again, gun control and this divide between the forces of incorporation and the resistors, in this case the cowboys, and who the Earps do not appreciate, especially that they bring their guns into town. And it's exactly that is the pretext for the showdown at the OK Corral, the most famous shootout in American history, which takes all of 30 seconds and leaves a good number of those, as you see, the cowboys dead, which then leads to a trial and acquittal of the Earps. They're exonerated. They're seen as having done their duty, and that leads to a retaliation by associates of the Clanton and McClory clan, who number actually about 200 of these cowboys, and they shoot and kill. Well, they shoot and injure Virgil, and then they kill Morgan, and that leads to the famous Earp vendetta ride, where the Earps and their associates go out after the cowboys and chase them all over Arizona. Frank Stillwell is shot in Tucson. While trying to hide under a train, and there's a statue actually of Wyatt Earp there in Tucson, right at the train station, which is fascinating. In any case, and it's analogous to what we get with Clint Eastwood in Whiskey Gap, where he goes on his own vendetta ride. So this kind of thing absolutely is this reality that we have here in the Old West, that it is these incorporating and resistance gunfighters. And they don't always break down neatly into these two sides, but this is definitely what it's like. And definitely, as I said, the Civil War had been this breeding ground for these gunfighters of the West, and now we have another Civil War being fought out in this bonanza economy that's taking place in this time period. Okay, and that's true whether it's a beef bonanza or gold and silver strikes. It's an ideology of vigilantism, which is a term that Richard White, another very, very famous historian in this kind of small field of American West historiography, calls it. And he estimates, and he's a revisionist historian, so he's not about the Old West and ramping up the body count and all the rest, but he estimates there's 200 vigilante groups that operate in the Old West from the Civil War to the 1890s. Okay, 200 vigilante groups, and really we can't know their body count. We can't know the amount of violence because they don't advertise. Now, Unforgiven gives us the violence, but it doesn't give this underlying structure that I'm talking about. That said, it does show us that there is no difference between the lawman and the outlaw. right? And that the forces of law and order are obsessive about gun control. So it gets that right, and it turns out the West was one with a registered gun, and that violence is a function of the fact that the Old West is first and foremost about money, not community. And because of that, it's a very corrupt and violent place. So, so good on Eastwood on all those counts. Now, another thing he does is he gives us the African Americans, okay? And maybe you notice that we get Morgan Freeman as the African American cowboy, and which might, for my generation, would seem jarring, and it would seem like a nod to political correctness and revisionist history, putting African Americans in the cowboy role. Because I grew up in a time where you watch these Sunday morning black and white westerns that went on all morning long, and super long. And pretty bad, and of course there were no black faces in these films at all. So this is what my generation grew up thinking the American West was like, but not so. African Americans were actually erased from the story, and they had a very active part in it. A good example of that. I'll give you two, but mostly here. Ned Huddleston, who later changes his name to Isom Dart when he tries to go straight. Great example. He's a slave in the South. He uncharacteristically helps out the Confederacy during the war, and then he becomes, and then he heads west, like so many do, and ends up raiding cattle from Mexico and selling them into the States, and so he becomes a classic rustler. Much like the cowboys that the Earps went up against in Tombstone, becomes a prospector for a while and a member of a classic Western gang. Then he wants to go straight. So he becomes a rancher in this really cool canyon between Wyoming and Colorado, where he starts where he sets up his own thing. He gets a homestead there. Okay. Now the problem he makes here in trying to go straight is he ends up taking up with Ann Bassett, who's this cattle rustler who's already got some infamy, and she's connected with Butch Cassidy's Table Rock gang. So, and because of that, because she has this history as a cattle rustler, they end up on the short list. That's in another one of these classic range wars. It's called the Browns Park Range War, where Detective Tom Horn is hired to deal with rustlers and free grazers that are a problem to the cattle barons, and he's told to leave town to get out, or he'll be killed. He decides to make a stand in his little homestead, which looks a lot like the one that Morgan Freeman is living in our Unforgiven film, and so he's shot dead, and that's the end of him. We also have another famous one is Nat Love, who is arguably Deadwood Dick, although a few Westerners claim that they were the inspiration for the Deadwood Dick pulp fiction series, which are the stories of the exploits of Deadwood Dick out west. And but it does line up very well with Nat Love, who also was a slave, headed west, and took to or he becomes an acquaintance of Billy the Kid and some of the other famous gunfighters of the Old West in a gang for a time. He's captured by the Pima natives, Pima Indian tribe at one point, I believe it was. Becomes a rodeo star. He's a sharpshooter, and has all these adventures out west that become the stuff of dime novels. And whether or not it's him that is Deadwood Dick or not, he claims that title for himself. And in the dime novels, what needs to be said too is he is whitened for white audiences, as all these African Americans are. But it turns out 25% of the cowboys, those 35,000 cowboys that I talked about in that free range era, in the cattle drive era, were African Americans, and it makes sense. It makes sense because given where the South is at after the Civil War, a lot of African Americans want to head west. Okay. And I've talked about this before. They have three options after the Civil War. You can go north, where Jim Crow is starting to take hold. You can go back to Africa, never a good idea, and only very few do, and it's always a tragedy. Or you can head west, and that's where you will find actually the most opportunity if you can get there. And African Americans, freedmen, go in groups, so they go in these organizations, much like the black settlements from Europe, for self-protection. Kansas is a favorite spot because of the John Brown legacy and the early Civil War battles that are fought there. So what we get is transplant communities of African Americans that had Western pretty good numbers in places like Kansas, and they're called the exodusters. Okay? So they're an important part of the story, and as I said, they end up in big numbers in the ranching industry and cowboying. Okay, so the film, or Clint Eastwood does a great job there, reminding us of this important fact that race, or that African Americans were good. They're a big part of the story. Oh yeah, and another thing where the film nails it is in prostitution. Prostitution and the nature of Western communities. And this gets us back to the earlier point that community is difficult in the West, and community here is not like the rest of the United States, not even close. For one, the American West is disproportionately male. And for a long time, and mining towns are the worst. 1850 population of California is 93% male. Young men between the ages of 20 and 40 make up 90% of those men in many mining camps, so they're also young. Cali is the first major strike, and then basically the nature of the economy is one strike after another, and we get people jumping all over the map as we get old coots with big ears hearing about the next one over the hill, right? So the following one is Nevada, the massive silver strikes there, and then we get Cripple Creek, Colorado. Arizona in the 1880s, we get Montana, Virginia City, Montana, and the last one is the Yukon in the 1896. Each of these, again, the bonanza economy, which also the reading by Richard Slotkin talks about that, the one that you had already earlier in the course. But they're all big population draws, and they're largely men, and they're what Richard White calls, and I love this quote, our big American West historian, he calls them a libertarian's dream world. Hey, which is just brilliant. And he says this, says, in a society that existed only to create wealth, government served only to secure and protect property. So towns really create their own laws, and gambling and prostitution are at the center of that community. The brothel, the tavern compete very well with the Protestant church, especially in smaller centers. And men here, and here's the thing, men tolerate this kind of a half world because they're transient. They're only here temporarily. They don't think of themselves as being stakeholders in this community. So they're accepting different standards than they would in the rest of the country, for sure. And of course, once they're wealthy, the plan is they will re-enter regular society. So that's the story of rootlessness and this gender imbalance and this sense of impermanence. And with that, you get, obviously, it makes sense that you'd have this thriving prostitution trade. And it's estimated how thriving that was. The estimates are that there were 50,000 women prostitutes in the American West in the late 19th century. Which makes sense given the ratio of men to women and the fact that there's a lot of money to spend. Another thing that really helps and that explains this acceptance of this half world, acceptance of a different standard than what obtains in the rest of the country, is this cultural worldview at the time. The Victorian era, there's this prevailing myth of the passionless woman, that women who enjoy sex, there's something wrong with them. There's something not quite right. So normal women did not enjoy sex; they endure it. And prostitutes, then, because they seem to, while they're paid to, they can act like it. They're these outliers. They're deviants. They did enjoy it. So this obviates the conscience. Okay, so that's kind of this interesting part of the context here as well. Okay, so when you start to study the American West, you're really struck by how accepted it is to do this part-time, even as needed. And we've got all sorts of examples of that from the famous woman in the American West. One of those is Wild Bill Hickok's partner later in life, Calamity Jane. She was a famous sharpshooter in Deadwood, South Dakota. She was a dance hall girl and part-time prostitute. Another is Doc Holliday's common law partner for most of his life. He always promised to give up gambling, and she promised to give up her work in prostitution, but neither of them did. Doc Holliday, he becomes partner of the Earp brothers by the time they land in Tombstone. Some prostitutes and especially madams could do very well in the early days. Okay? And one of those is, there's all sorts of examples. One of them is Pearl DeVere. She's a famous brothel owner in Cripple Creek, Colorado. In 1893, she is charging $250 a night for her services, which today would be probably over $5,000. We've got a woman named Julia Boulette in Virginia City, Nevada. She's a famous madame who gets, she's such a pillar of the community that when she's murdered by a client in 1867, that the whole town shuts down. And as a leading citizen, she gets this massive funeral that everybody comes out to. Chicago Joe is another example. Chicago Joe is from Helena, Montana. She's one of the few to make it really, really big. She got very wealthy off of a series of brothels that she owned and worked in. And with that money, she starts to invest in real estate in Helena. And pretty soon she owns most of the main street. Along with her husband, she also opens this dance hall called the Red Light Saloon. And yeah, she becomes the biggest landowner in the whole district. And again, like Julie Boulette, she's a pillar of the community. And there's this great notice she put in the newspaper one time, which reveals to us that her husband is more a drag on her than anything else. That she's notifying liquor dealers not to give her husband any credit anymore, and if they do, she will prosecute. So he's busy trying to ruin her while she's busy ensuring their pensions. Any case, this is early days in prostitution. This independence and the kind of the glory days, the madams of the American West, and there definitely was that time period. And selling yourself is a pretty easy choice in this male-dominated society, especially if you've been abandoned, or you're divorced, or you're widowed, and you have children to support. And that's always often what motivates these women to do this. The money is just too good, and it's just too tempting. That independence, though, changes in the 1880s, so the era of the successful madame is pretty short. And we know that by the 1890s, mostly it is men, and it's pimps, men who are the pimps and run the brothels, and women get treated more increasingly as property. And some of them die in very ugly ways. A large percentage of venereal diseases, botched abortions, alcoholism, suicide, or like Julie Boulette, would be killed by their clients. It needs to be said too that a fair number in the American West, a large percentage, prostitution is really nothing but slavery, because there is trafficking of women, especially of Chinese and Native American women. A lot of them are trafficked. Not all, though. Indigenous women in general are more open to this as a rational choice, and more open with sharing sexual favors, and that goes back. The more you study history, the more you start to realize that the history of North America going back to the fur traders. But in any case, some of them were open to that as a rational choice, and some independent First Nations women work the dance halls out of their own choice to do so. The effect of that, though, is interesting, is that all Native women are considered crones or prostitutes, because a large percentage of them did work the dance halls. But yeah, as far as the Western community goes, Eastwood really nails it, because he makes prostitutes the heart of the story. Skinny's Tavern is the heart of Whiskey Gap. The main character in the film is the prostitutes, and they live together in their own home. They work for Skinny, but they can do well. And his tavern, the bigger point is, it's the center of town. Right? So this is accurate. We know this. Right? This is accurate in this time. It's what makes the American West unique. Centrality of prostitution. Prostitution is normalized. And by the way, the madame in the film, Strawberry Alice, was at that point Clint Eastwood's wife. That's Frances Fisher. And but yeah, so there. Prostitution and the nature of Western communities. A lot you can do with that, but that sums it up. Eastwood does a good job on that. And then you've got the dime novel phenomenon, right? English Bob has a biography. English Bob is just awesome, right? You might have recognized him as Dumbledore from a couple of Harry Potter movies, and now you're going, oh, that's it. Anyway, but he's got, Saul Rubinek just does a fabulous job as his biographer, right? Telling his stories in real time, because he's still gunfighting. So he's got his own biographer along with him, who's creating the myth as it's happening, which is exactly what the American West is all about. It's a complete truism. Pulp Fiction, dime novel phenom. Wild West heroes are constructed while they're still alive, and in fact, it's in some weird ways. Kit Carson, who was that early trapper, hunter, friend of natives, but also sometimes Indian fighter, and really one of the big mountain men who becomes the first to become a dime novel phenomenon. He one time he's on the Santa Fe Trail, and he comes across a wagon where a man and his son have been butchered by the Apache who've been traveling through, and they've headed off. And there's others around that have come onto the scene, but Kit Carson is there not long after it happens. So the famous Kit Carson, and he takes off after them to rescue the one survivor who had been the wife in this party, appropriately named Mrs. White. So he charges up the trail. He does eventually not find the Apache, but he finds Mrs. White's body. So she's been killed, and he gets there too late. And on her person, he finds a dime novel of himself, the great Kit Carson, who always gets his man, who always wins out in the end. So it's just profound irony, and it's not an apocryphal story. It's fascinating how the story is being told. These people are becoming, the myth machine is making them into heroes even while they're alive. And if you watch that movie, The Alamo with Billy Bob Thornton, you'll see that as well, where Davy Crockett it becomes the legendary Davy, even before mid career before he's even gone to Texas. He's already a national legend, and been turned into something larger than life, right? Could whip a what was it, whip a whack of wildcats or something, anyway, whatever. Could grin a bar out of a tree and all these other nonsense things, right? But in any case, this is 100% accurate to history, is that the American West is becoming a legend even as it's happening. And this gets right out campy weird when we start to get the Wild West shows that become a big thing by the 1870s. And probably the weirdest of all is Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He'll do anything. He calls it the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. But this time he's already been part of the dime novel phenomenon, because he's put out his weekly magazine of stories from himself largely, and he's a mule skinner. He was a buffalo hunter out west. Took part in the decimation of the buffalo herds, extermination of those, and and then he goes off to found this Wild West show and takes it traveling to Europe, and maybe you know this stuff, right? But he uses real Native American warriors, and they would reenact battles that they had participated in, and not that long ago, and some of which hadn't finished. In fact, the Indian Wars were nowhere near finished in the 1870s. They don't end until Geronimo's capture in the mid 1880s. But yeah, Sitting Bull becomes part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, along with Annie Oakley and all these other famous sharpshooters. And as does Geronimo. Geronimo ends up in the Buffalo Bill show too, a couple years after that. Now, many of these, what they were called show Indians, they go on to star in silent films. But yeah, the Battle of Wounded Knee doesn't happen till the 1890s, and this is and the last major capture is Geronimo in the mid 1880s. But these shows precede that. So the American West becoming legend before it's over. Enough said there. The film does a great job with that, and it kind of makes it's. I think some of the most pleasurable parts of the film are around Saul Rubinek and English Bob. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about that the film invites us into is this idea of self-defense, the theme of self-defense, and it's throughout the film. I suppose you know, Bob, if I ever see you again, I'm just going to start shooting and figure it was self-defense. That's little Bob to English Bob as he sends him on his way, right? When in that final scene in the tavern, when Money shoots Skinny, right? And little Bill's like, "You cowardly skunk! You just shot an unarmed man." And he says, "He should have defended himself." Right? In the film, anything is fine anything is kosher so long as the other guy is armed. And this is why Beauchamp doesn't want to pick up that gun, right? This is why he's also he doesn't in that final scene too. He doesn't want to get shot. This is why too that Beauchamp is horrified when he finds out when he's in jail, when he finds out that English Bob killed a man when he didn't even have a gun. And little Bill says, well, Bob wasn't going to wait for Corky to grow a new hand. Now this points to an interesting and a unique the fact that America has a unique approach both to guns, the right to have them, but also the laws around self-defense. And the two didn't happen right away. It's not like we had the Second Amendment and then it came with the right to stand your ground. In fact, the Second Amendment still had the old British common law of duty to retreat. It still did not take on the British common law of duty to retreat. And quite simply, every Western nation basically has adopted the old British common law, and the British had it the first, which is that when you're faced with a deadly threat, you have a duty to get away, to do everything in your power to get away from it before responding to it, right? But the attitude and the law in America is very different. That when faced with a deadly threat, Americans have a right to stand their ground and fight. They do not have a duty to retreat. And well, it's fraught because self-defense always is, but the preponderance of the law is against duty to retreat, and this gets back actually to the American West, and it gets it's actually quite specific, which is beautiful when it is, and that gets down to this the original gunfight or showdown or walk down in the American West, which was in Springfield, Missouri, the aptly named Springfield, which is in every state. That's the myth, actually. The Simpsons Springfield is a stand-in for everywhere in the United States, but only about maybe 15 states have Springfields. Anyway, Springfield, Missouri is the site of the first challenge of duty to retreat law. Okay? And it happens when Wild Bill Hickok and Dave Tutt have this first original Old West walkdown. And it happens over a gambling debt that Tutt owes Wild Bill. Evidently, it's 1865, and there's other stuff going on. There's a woman involved, and between them. In any case, it doesn't matter. They decide they're going to take this outside, and they meet at an appointed time on opposite ends of the square in Springfield. And well, I guess you know what happens next. Wild Bill pulls his gun a little bit faster, and Dave Tutt doesn't respond so well because his chest already been exploded by the .36 caliber lead ball from Hickok's quicker volley. Now Hickok gets arrested and charged with murder, and as we know, but because we've seen enough Western movies, but Americans are just learning this is not the way it's supposed to end. So Hickok goes to trial, and the charge gets reduced to manslaughter, but the judge he's still not off the hook, and the judge rejects the self-defense invocation on the part of Hickok and his lawyer. And in fact, it's a trial by jury, and he reads the duty to retreat instructions to the jury that Hickok should have retreated from a fight, and hence this is murder. Judge misreads the mood of the Missouri jury here. This is the frontier America at that time, and they're not going to have any of this duty to retreat legalese. They find Hickok not guilty, and the precedent is set. And pretty soon all courts fall in line, more or less. Judges change their instructions to reflect the jury's choice, and law is based on precedent, as you know, and it gets a huge boost when this guy, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's like head of the Supreme Court in the United States for like 120 years or something, not quite, but a very long time, and he's a hero of neocons today because he is all about the getting rid of duty to retreat, right, and the right to stand your ground. Okay, and in fact, he says as much. In his cases, he decides that way. In one of his decisions, he says even that the duty to retreat is unsuited to both the American mindset and the age of firearms, which is a hell of a thing to say. Okay. He finally retired in 1932, the oldest man to have ever served on the court, all-American hero, very famous, And he gave history this line too: "A man is not born to run away." He said that in 1929, which really encapsulates all of it. So even though he's based on precedent that was set before him, it's quite simple. The retreat doctrine gets rejected, and it's due to the influence of frontier violence. Okay, and that rebounds right down to today, where you have many states that have stand your ground laws that require police not to arrest someone absent any eyewitnesses that refute their claim of self-defense, and that Americans have a right to use deadly force when they feel threatened, either in their vehicle or in their home, and it's led to all sorts of disasters. One of the most famous was the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin case where Trayvon Martin had some Skittles and George Zimmerman shoots him down, right? But because of the stand your ground law in Florida at the time, he's not charged, right? So the point is, this idea of what frontier justice was like remains influential. Even if the West was a place where gun control is more common than shootouts, the idea of the gunfighter protecting himself, beginning there with the Wild Bill Hickok jury, where they accepted this idea, it influences laws even now. Okay, so that is the story and the glory. This is as far as I want to take it, and that's I think that we've pretty much nailed it. Again, the film is accurate on a bunch of themes, including things like race, community, prostitution, gender, right, law and order, and the idea of how slippery or how slim the difference is that a commission is all that separates the law from the outlaw, which is true of the American West: civility, gun control, and stand your ground, duty to retreat, self-defense, right? And in that central theme, violence, and how the individual is really not in control here, in this place, in this time, in American history. And also that the West is about money, first and foremost. It's a corrupt, it's a violent place where the game is very much fixed by those who already have money. And actually that strays into what the film kind of misses, absolutely misses, is that it doesn't give us that any kind of sense that there's a structure to this violence. Okay, so it's not satisfying in that way. But and in fact, instead it gives us an ending that could have been taken from a John Wayne film, a Western of the 1960s. But it's Clint Eastwood, so it works. And it consistently goes down as the best Western film of all time. It's consistently voted there at the top of that list or near it. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that lecture. I hope you see what you can get, or what you can get out of a Western, a little bit different than other films. And yeah, thanks for listening. Any questions, definitely let me know. Take care.